Continuing in Chapter 2 on page 14, discussing Mark Baker and the Baker family, parents of Mary Baker Eddy. A clear description of Mark Baker was given to a Christian Scientist in 1902 by Deacon Gardner S. Abbott of Tilton, New Hampshire, who knew Mr. Baker for many years. Deacon Abbott spoke of him as follows. Squire Baker was a man of strong character, highly respected in the community, whose opinion was sought and valued. He was very much of a gentleman, well-read, a good talker, and he expressed himself clearly and forcibly. He treated all men with kindness and respect. He was a pleasant gentleman to meet. In the same conversation, Deacon Abbott related an incident to illustrate Mr. Baker's manner of speaking. When he was superintendent of the Congregational Sunday School at Sanbornton Ridge or Tilton, he appointed me a teacher and asked me to take a particular class of boys. I always remember how he introduced me to the class. He said, "Young gentlemen, in the absence of your former teacher, I introduce you to Mr. Abbott, your present teacher." Mrs. Eddy wrote in 1891 that her father possessed a strong intellect and an iron will. She also wrote in 1907 that he was a great reader and was uniformly dignified, a well-informed, intellectual man, cultivated in mind and manners. Her memory of him was vivid. Of my mother I cannot speak as I would, for memory recalls qualities to which the pen can never do justice. These are Mrs. Eddy's words. Everybody who knew Mrs. Baker either liked her or loved her. Even the opponents of Christian Science who have found faults in Miss Eddy have exaggerated the oddities of her father, never have attempted to fasten any blame or censure upon her mother. Thus, the attack on Mrs. Eddy, that seems to have been most unfair, contained the following admissions. Mrs. Eddy's mother was a gentle, capable, conscientious New England housewife. In the community and in her home, she was always a peaceful and inspiring influence. Mrs. Baker had much to do as wife and mother. She lived before most people conceded the equality of women with men. Reread. Mrs. Baker had much to do as a wife and mother. She lived before most people conceded the equality of women with men. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. One more time. Mrs. Baker had much to do as wife and mother. She lived before most people conceded the equality of women with men. But these circumstances did not deprive her of an intellectual life, nor did they keep her from expressing her mental self. She read commendable books, she talked well, her opinions and sentiments were sought and valued by friends and neighbors. When Mrs. Baker passed on in November 1849, the New Hampshire Patriot and State Gazette printed an obituary including the following tribute. Kind and conciliatory in manner, wise and prudent, in counsel at all times cheerful and hopeful, she was the presiding genius of a lovely circle and happy home. Her letters have survived to the present time, those of a loving mother and an educated woman. At times she disclosed a philosophic vein. Thus, in a letter of April 9th, 1844, noting that the person reading this has a degree in philosophy and history and humanities and social science and specialized in non-traditional student mentoring and special education, as well as social and political philosophy and utopian communities. Yeah, that kind of happened. Pedigreed through the University of North Carolina at Asheville, top of my class. Graduated cum laude with distinctions in history. Her letters that have survived to the present time are those of a loving mother and an educated woman. At times she disclosed a philosophic vein. Thus, in a letter of April 9th, 1844, to her daughter Mary, she wrote, "Forget the past, enjoy the present, hope for the future." So also, in a letter dated September 2nd, 1848, owned by the Long Year Foundation, Mrs. Baker wrote to her son George, quote, "I have been reading Tapon on the Will. That is excellent." End quote. I have not read that piece. Doubtless she referred to the doctrine of the will applied to moral agency and responsibility by Henry Philip Tappan. I have not read it, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. Tappan, who had been a professor of moral and intellectual philosophy in the New York University and was the first to be president of the University of Michigan. Interesting. First to be president of the University of Michigan. Except for comparatively short times, Mrs. Eddy lived with her parents until 1849, when she was 28 years old. Then, her mother having passed on, she lived with her father for another year when he remarried. In his later years, he died in 1865, Mrs. Eddy and her father lived at different places most of the time. Of all the persons with whom Mary Baker Eddy came in contact, her mother must have affected her much the most. She loved her mother devotedly, and they were together most of the time during the years which included the most impressionable part of the daughter's life. Thank you. Beautifully written. And chapter 2. Book Historical Sketches. Bedtime Stories to Suki, who is a Japanese chin who is very much so deaf, but likes to watch Mommy read. Love to everybody. Sweet dreams.